South Carolina, law enforcement officials are looking into two individuals related to the death of Stephen Smith. These two individuals were named very early on in the investigation, and we'll be coming back to talk about them a little later in this video. There is a huge connection made between the Stephen Smith death investigation and the MURDAUGHs. We have only just begun to dive deep into the connections between Randy Murdaugh and Randolph Murdaugh III, the Murdaugh family allies and supplicants, and the Stephen Smith investigation. The connections run so deep and are so far-reaching, it is all but impossible to believe that they are all the result of random chance of coincidence, particularly for the connections for which proof exists in the form of legal documents and law enforcement reports. This is what we are looking at in this episode. This past weekend, Stephen Smith's remains were exhumed and a second autopsy was performed. An investigation was reopened into Stephen Smith's death, and that investigation is underway, but it was only reopened and taken seriously after the Alex Murdaugh trial cast shameful and humiliating attention on SLED and the incomplete investigation into Stephen Smith's death, along with the investigative report that is a complete mismatch with the autopsy report, the first autopsy report. It's important to remember that there are two parts to a death investigation. There is the autopsy report conducted by a pathologist. In this case, that was Dr. Aaron Presnell. And then there is the crime scene report or the investigator's report. It'll be called either one depending on where you're at. And together, those create the death investigation. We are going to look at these two parts of the death investigation separately. First is the investigator's report, and specifically the indications of corruption in the 14th Judicial District and the connections to the Murdaugh family and their associates. Randy, or Randolph Murdaugh IV, and Randolph Murdaugh III have more in common than just their name. In the last episode on Stephen Smith, we discussed both Randy and Randolph III were named back in 2015 in connection to the early stages of the Stephen Smith death investigation. Randolph III was known to swiftly and effectively clean up any messes his family members made that sullied the once good Murdaugh family name, and it was Randolph III who became part of the Stephen Smith story, second only to the person who notified the family of Stephen's tragic death. Since it was announced that the manner of Stephen Smith's 2015 death in Bamberg County, South Carolina, was changed from undetermined to homicide, information about the events that took place in 2015 that had been tucked away and covered up have come to surface, and it is so important we support Stephen's mother and family, and that we take part in ensuring that justice is served for Stephen Smith, and because it is critical that each of us take part in the justice system if we want to enjoy the liberties a working justice system affords us. Back to the two individuals being viewed by SLED as persons of interest in connection with Stephen Smith's death back in 2015. They are Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. Patrick and Sean were tangled up in a number of legal actions tied to the Murdaugh family in months following the murder of Stephen Smith back in 2015. Daryl Williams is the self-described stepfather of Patrick Wilson, and he's the man who called in a tip to the Hampton Police Department right after Stephen's death in 2015. According to him, Patrick Wilson told him that his friend Sean Connolly, who was another Hampton teenager at the time, was drunk and driving a vehicle that may have struck and killed Stephen Smith. And we all know who told him to share that information. According to the MATE death investigation report, and specifically Proctor's report, that person was none other than Randy Murdaugh, Alex's brother, Paul and Buster's uncle, and Randolph III's son. It is interesting enough that Randy Murdaugh is the person who told Daryl Williams to make a report to the authorities. This naturally raises some questions such as, how does Randy know Daryl Williams in the first place? And why would Daryl Williams confide this information that incriminates his stepson to Randy Murdaugh, of all people? If he was going to talk, why not talk to a friend or family member about the information he learned? We can only speculate how Randy Murdaugh knew Daryl Williams and why or how he learned this critical information about Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. Also, as an attorney from a well-respected family, wouldn't you think that Randy would want to ensure this information that would lead to justice for a young man who lost his life before he could actualize his dreams would end up in the right hands? In the hands of a law enforcement agency that could do something about it? Although we can only speculate, to the answers to these questions, there are a few facts that may reveal the answers or begin to reveal the answers at the very least. Let's first look at the timing of Daryl Williams' report about Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly and other things that happened around that time. So back in December of 2015, several things were happening, including this report from Daryl Williams. On December 7th, somebody made an anonymous tip to SCHP, the South Carolina Highway Patrol. This is in the case file in the Mate Death Investigation Report. Ontario Aiken, along with another black male and a white male, and then after that, it's noted in parentheses, it says Murdaugh, are the ones involved in the death. So we know that they are referring to Buster Murdaugh, who was named 40 times in the investigation. Now, I do want to say that I am by no means implicating Buster Murdaugh as being guilty in the death of Stephen Smith. In fact, I personally, and this is just a personal belief, don't believe that he was involved. I don't see that as being in his character. Nevertheless, this is what the notes said in the Mate report. A local newspaper then ran a story that mentioned a prominent local family might be involved in the death of Stephen Smith. And this is a critical fact, in my opinion, because it was shortly after that that Randy Murdaugh supposedly told Daryl Williams to make a report to the South Carolina Highway Patrol about what was told to him regarding Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. After that initial newspaper article ran mentioning that a prominent local family might be involved in the death of Stephen Smith, several publications began to pick up that same story and that same narrative, and here is one example. Now, this story is dated December 16th, 2021. Remember that date? It's very important because just 4 days later, on December 21st, Corporal Duncan of the South Carolina Highway Patrol calls Ginn of the Hampton Police Department to ask him about the report that Daryl Williams made about Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. That was, of course, the result of Randy Murdaugh's urging Williams to make that report. Thank you to my smart and caring viewers and moderators who reminded me to add allegedly. I'm just going to read a portion of the article entitled "The Lawyer Who Tried Faking His Death and the Writer Exposing His Crime Dynasty." The article starts out talking about the boat crash that took the life of sweet Mallory Beach, who was only 19 years old, and the questions regarding whether or not Paul Murdaugh was driving the boat, and Alex's involvement in meddling with the question of who was driving the boat, ostensibly to save his son's skin, and, well, really, seriously, his own skin. The article goes on to say, before an investigation could prove whether Paul was the tiller and boating under the influence or confirm witness testimony that Alec obstructed the crash investigation, Paul, age 19, and his 52-year-old mother, Maggie, were found shot to death at the family's 1,800-acre hunting estate on June 7th, 2021. 3 months later, the narrative was further confounded by conflicting reports that Alec had been shot in the back of the head and left for dead on the side of the road. He has since admitted the scene was staged to grease a $10 million insurance payout for his older son Buster, himself rumored to be involved with the unexplained death of 19-year-old nursing student named Stephen Smith in 2015. This was before Alex's partners cut ties amid allegations that he embezzled the family law firm out of millions, allegedly to fund an insatiable opioid addiction. After that bombshell dropped, Alex was charged with stealing millions more from a settlement meant for the children of his former housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, who we're going to mention in just a moment here, guys, who died in a 2018 alleged trip and fall accident on their property. The article does not end there. If you would like to read it, I'm going to leave the link in the description box.
This case that we've got, I'll go over a little bit about. We've got some information, about certain things, and this was a tip that was given to us from, I believe, a Patrick Wilson. It's a he said, she said deal that we've gathered that information so far.
Right.
And I believe this come from is it a Darren Williams? Is that correct?
It's Daryl.
Daryl Williams. Okay.
Yep.
And do you know Daryl?
Yes.
Okay. How do
yep.
you?
He is my stepdad technically.
Okay. All right. Can you tell me what was told to you? We've tried to get in touch with Patrick, but he's kind of avoiding the call, the contact, and all.
Right. Basically, Daryl called me and he said, "Look," he said, "this is what I was told." He said, "Patrick, come over here to the house." He said he told me that Sean Connolly was drunk and hit something. He said he went back the next day to see what it was he had hit, and he seen a lot of police out there. So he talked to one of the cops, and then he had left, and then he learned, I guess by media, that somebody had been killed.
Okay, so there's some really curious things about this call right off the bat. First of all, it's very interesting that Michael Duncan says that they can't find Patrick Wilson. They live in rural South Carolina. Apparently, according to what Nick Ginn said, Daryl Williams is his stepdaddy, and he's also Patrick Wilson's stepdaddy, so certainly he has to know where Patrick Wilson is. And also, in the mate report under Proctor's report, he states, "I then found Legacy Utah Baptist School. Patrick Wilson is a student there, but was not at school today." Well, dang, can't they go back to the school tomorrow or the next day or next week? But guys, remember, it really is all about the timing. It's very curious that in December 2021, and remember, Stephen Smith was killed on July 8th, 2015. It's very curious that in December, when those newspaper articles started running, the first one around December 7th, and then on December 16th was the article that I read an excerpt of just a little bit earlier in this video. Then all of a sudden on December 21st, law enforcement is taking interest in the Stephen Smith death investigation. So wait. 6.5 years have passed with no progress being made, no investigation happening into Stephen Smith's death. And all of a sudden, after these newspaper articles start running, implicating the Murdaughs in wrongdoings, all of a sudden they are interested and they are investigating. But they don't seem to really know much about anything or have any sincere interest in solving the death investigation of a 19-year-old young man who had nothing but a bright future ahead of him, which lends to the question, were they really trying to solve anything? Or were they all in on the gig? Was the fix in? Did they all know that perhaps, maybe, possibly, allegedly, Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly were decoys so people would look the other way? Now, if you know me and know my channel, you know that I am not into conspiracy theories. I am not into anything that is not founded in evidence, but I am willing to ask the critical questions. So let's go back to what we know. What else do we know about Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly? Well, we know that Patrick Wilson was charged with attempted murder on April 17th, 2015. Apparently, Wilson was in his car. Sean Connolly was his passenger. Wilson got into an argument with another guy in a car, and he pulled out a gun and fired it at the man's car, or in the direction of the man's car. The man that he fired the gun towards, or at least in his direction, had 2 passengers. According to the testimony of the 2 passengers in the car and the man driving the car, they were all afraid for their lives. In August of 2015, Patrick Wilson was indicted by a grand jury on the charges of attempted murder and assault and battery. While Patrick Wilson was out on bond, the family that he shot at filed multiple harassment charges against Patrick Wilson. Of course, Patrick Wilson needed an attorney to help him out in this really troublesome legal situation. And would you ever believe who Patrick Wilson's attorney was that represented him when he was facing these charges? His attorney was close friend of the Murdaugh family, Corey Fleming. Corey Fleming is the same person who Alec Murdaugh referred Gloria Satterfield's son to represent her children in a civil suit against him for her death on his property. Oh my gosh, this is so twisted. The long and the short of Corey Fleming's story is that his law license is temporarily suspended. And, well, a bit more than that, too. Listen to this.
44 pages, 4 new charges against Alec Murdaugh and 18 charges against Corey Fleming. That indictment by a Beaufort County grand jury states that Murdaugh recommended his good friend to be the lawyer for the Satterfield family, and then together they allegedly stole millions in insurance money. It's the first time Fleming has been charged, but Alec Murdaugh's own lawyers have brought up his involvement before.
Land and those guys have already settled the case with Corey Fleming. It's amazing to us that the focus is on just Alec. There are other people who are participating in this process.
And apparently that grand jury was listening. Fleming now facing charges ranging from money laundering to computer crimes, criminal conspiracy, making false statements, and breach of trust, all stemming from the alleged scheme to steal more than $4 million in insurance money from the Satterfield family after Gloria Satterfield died in an apparent accident at the Murdaughs' home in 2018. Alec has already been indicted for stealing money from her sons. This new indictment says Fleming also took part in the fraud, using the insurance money meant for Satterfield's to pay for his own mortgage and, quote, his large credit card debt.
Now, would you believe there's more? Corey Fleming also temporarily represented Connor Cook in his lawsuit in 2019, and in both the case of Gloria Satterfield and Connor Cook, there's lawsuits against Corey Fleming for wrongdoing in those cases. It seems that whenever Alec Murdaugh had a problem he needed handled, Corey Fleming was his man. He was right there to represent whoever Alex Murdaugh needed manipulated or leveraged or shut up or covered up. Corey Fleming was his man. So going back to Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly, who are persons of interest in the Stephen Smith death investigation. Remember, my friends, it is all about the timing. Wilson was charged with 3 counts of attempted murder on April 17th, 2015. That means at the time of Stephen Smith's death on July 8th, 2015, Patrick Wilson was facing those 3 attempted murder charges. With Corey Fleming as his representation, whatever happened of those charges against Patrick Wilson? Those charges were dropped, null pros, not prosecuted, with no plea deal. Those charges were dropped by 14th Judicial Circuit Solicitor Duffy Stone. Yep, that's right, Duffy Stone, who preceded Alec Murdaugh's grandfather and then father is 14th Judicial Circuit Solicitor, and the same Duffy Stone who gave Alec Murdaugh his badge. That badge that he displayed when he went to the hospital after the boat crash that took Mallory Beach's life, when he and his father, Randolph III, tried to convince Connor Cook and Connor Cook's family that it was a good idea to tell the world that Connor Cook was driving that boat of death. Connor Cook, who was represented for a time by Corey Fleming, who also represented Gloria Satterfield's children, and who also represented Patrick Wilson on his charges, his 3 charges of attempted murder and assault and battery that were dismissed by Duffy Stone, the man that gave Alec Murdaugh his badge. And yet you see how this goes? We could go in these circles of connection to Alec Murdaugh for a long, long time. So let's circle back to the conversation between Michael Duncan of South Carolina Highway Patrol and Nick Ginn of Hampton Police Department, when Nick Ginn told Michael Duncan the account he heard from Daryl Williams about Patrick Wilson relaying to him Sean Connolly's involvement in Stephen Smith's death. And remember, according to Tom Proctor and the official case files, which is all we have to go off of, it was Randy Murdaugh who prompted Daryl Williams to make that call. Both officers in this recording acknowledged that this is the only concrete information that they had learned in this investigation.
Well, I heard some rumors around town, but as far as anything that I could say that had any kind of possible validity would be this.
Right. Just the only thing you've heard prior to this is rumors.
Right.
Okay.
So here is one of the big questions. With all of these Murdaughs being named in the investigation, Randy Murdaugh, Randolph III Murdaugh, the patriarch of the family, and we know that Buster Murdaugh was mentioned 40 times in the investigation, and we can now prove that because we have complete case notes. And also with all the known connections to Alec Murdaugh that are connected to the Stephen Smith death investigation, and these 2 then teenagers, Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly, were mentioned as being persons of interest in a very direct way, although it was through the suggestion of Randy Murdaugh. Then the question is why? Why the heck were no Murdaughs questioned about Stephen Smith's death? And why the heck was neither Patrick Wilson or Sean Connolly directly questioned about Stephen Smith's death? Well, we know the answer, and if you watched my last video, you definitely know the answer, and that is because Dr. Aaron Presnell ruled the manner of Stephen Smith's death to be undetermined and the cause of death to be a vehicle accident, although it flies in the face of any and all evidence and lack of evidence that existed at the scene where Stephen Smith's car was found, and then the scene 3 miles away where Stephen Smith's body was found in the middle of the road, in the center line of the road. Let's talk about the other part of a death investigation, which is the autopsy. I personally spoke with a friend of mine, Dr. Dre, who is a former assistant coroner, and another friend of mine who is a doctor who does a lot of forensic work in his capacity as being a doctor. He is not a medical examiner, but he does a lot of forensic work, and both of them said this, basically the exact same thing. If somebody were hit by any kind of a vehicle with a force that resulted in the kind of wound that was found on Stephen Smith's head, then one of two things would have happened, depending on how the car hit the person and where it hit the person and how fast they were going and if they were turning or not. Basically, the person would roll onto the hood and then possibly right over the car, or end up on top of the car, to the side of the car, but there would be injuries on that person, indicating that they rolled onto the hood and, whatever else happened after that. Or the person would be hit, they would fall to the ground in front of the car, they would go under the car, and depending on what the car did, if it turned, if it went straight, if it stopped, they might be just to the side of the car with clear signs that they were hit and went under the car for a moment, or the car would just run over them. Also, we know that hit with a force that ended up in a wound the size of the wound on Stephen Smith's head, he would have come right out of his loosely tied shoes. So there's so much about the way he was found and the way everything was found that does not support Dr. Presnell's ruling. Officers and corporals from the South Carolina Highway Patrol questioned the idea that this was an accident vigorously. SLED accepted the ruling and moved on, with not so much as a mention or likely a thought to Stephen Smith over 8 years, until Alec Murdaugh went on trial for the double homicide of his wife and son, and the attention SLED was receiving was too shameful and too humiliating for them to handle, so they decided to reopen the investigation. Although nothing in the investigators' report indicated a vehicle accident, SLED decided to go with the ruling that Dr. Presnell included in her autopsy report that was fully unsupported. So here are some details on Dr. Presnell's opinion. Autopsy number 1, conducted by Aaron Presnell, ruled that the manner of death was undetermined and the cause of death was a vehicle accident. Now, I want to note that Stephen Smith's name isn't even spelled right in this autopsy report, which I find to be very disrespectful. I spoke with 2 experts while researching and investigating Stephen Smith's death and the investigation that happened, and both of them said that the cause of death listed on this autopsy report and the manner of death are very, very rarely found together on an autopsy report because they don't really go together. And then there's this. As of the time that the video was created on April 8th, 2023, the second autopsy report has not yet been released, but a person who was in the autopsy suite, as she says, when the autopsy was conducted, has this to say.
There was no debris in the road. Typically when you find a hit-and-run motor vehicle accident, you'll find debris from the grille or the mirror or something of that nature, and there was none. In addition, oftentimes when a pedestrian is struck by a vehicle, they are literally knocked out of their shoes.
And then there's this. In the mate report, we read several pages from Agent Proctor, who tried very hard to keep the investigation going. In 2 pages, he describes his interactions with Dr. Aaron Presnell after the autopsy report came out. He was questioning why she ruled the way she did, and apparently, as he says, it was ill-received. The coroner at the time, Washington, eventually spoke with her, and the conclusion of their conversation was this, and I'm reading from the last sentence on this page. The coroner stated that he made contact with the pathologist, Dr. Presnell, and she stated that she would be willing to change her report to read however he wanted. And then there's this, and what I believe to be a channel exclusive. I did some deep digging on Aaron Presnell, and I found a case from Colton County, South Carolina, where a gentleman named Mr. Larios died while he was on the job, and a second autopsy concluded that he died from electrocution. Dr. Aaron Presnell in this report goes on to describe many injuries that she says he had, and her opinion was that he died from blunt force trauma. In this report, it describes what she said, noting that she made absolutely no mentions of electrocution. The end of this report goes on to talk about how the coroner gave her a call and had a discussion with her, questioning her findings, and she started to basically back off her findings in the autopsy. It doesn't sound like she is very confident in the opinion she renders in her autopsy reports. Now, does it? I typically like to end a video with some kind of summary, some kind of a summary statement. However, for this video, I think we are left with more questions than we have answers. And there is still more to come, and there is still a huge issue of justice for all of us to fight for Stephen Smith, so his mother and his family can finally be at peace. Towards that end of justice for Stephen and peace for his family, there is some good news on the way. Do you remember this guy, Dr. Kenneth Kinsey? Dr. Kenneth Kinsey, who testified in the Alec Murdaugh trial and, in my opinion, brought forth the most compelling and riveting testimony and facts that likely, in my opinion, helped to put Alec Murdaugh behind bars, although I think he was his biggest help in getting him behind bars, but that's a whole nother video. Although it is a SLED investigation that has reopened the death investigation of Stephen Smith, Dr. Kenneth Kinsey is independently running what he refers to as a parallel investigation, reconstructing the scene of the crime and doing all of the other investigative magic that he does. And thank God for Kenneth Kinsey and his independent investigation, because if this were still all in the hands of SLED, my Lord above, who knows what would happen. Thank you so much for watching. Please take a moment to hit like and subscribe if you like the content, and look for everything that's coming up on this channel, continuing to look into issues of corruption in the Stephen Smith investigation, and also the investigation into the deaths of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh and the life of Miss Maggie Murdaugh. Everyone be safe, and I look forward to seeing you next time.